I saw my name nowhere, not on the seating chart, not on a place card, not even scribbled on a cocktail napkin. Still, I stood there, clutching the small velvet box I'd brought as a gift, heart pounding like I'd walked into the wrong house by mistake. I wasn't late. I wasn't mistaken. I had been asked not to come, only no one had said the words out loud, not until now. "I'm sorry. You weren't invited. Go away." Those were my daughter Lana's exact words. Her voice didn't break when she said them. Her hands didn't tremble. She looked at me with a practiced stillness, as if rehearsed, as if she had known this moment would come and had prepared exactly how to get through it. I remember staring at her face, so heavily made up it barely looked like the little girl I used to read to every night. Around us, guests mingled, sipping champagne. Music played. A photographer clicked photos in the background, catching the radiant bride in every angle but this one. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't even ask why. I just nodded, once, and turned back toward the parking lot, heels echoing on the flagstone path as I walked away from the wedding I had paid for. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 67 years old. I raised my daughter alone, built a business from nothing, and loved her without question, even when it cost me everything. Today, I learned what that love is worth to her. Today, I am finally telling the truth. I wasn't born into much. My parents had hearts bigger than their pockets, and I grew up learning to patch clothes, mend fences, and stretch every dollar as far as it could go. By the time I was 23, I had married a man who made me laugh until my stomach hurt. His name was Thomas, and he had dreams of opening a record store, a modest life, and maybe 3 kids if we could swing it. But dreams change quickly when cancer enters the room. Thomas was gone by the time Lana turned 6. I remember her small hands holding mine at the funeral, her face too young to understand that her father had vanished from her life before she'd even formed her longest memories of him. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. With only a high school diploma and a few $100s to my name, I got to work. The bookstore wasn't planned. It began as a folding table at the farmer's market, stacked with used novels from estate sales and library discards. People lingered. They asked for recommendations. They came back. Eventually, I saved enough to rent a storefront in a quiet corner of Portland, and that little shop became Vance Books, the first of what would eventually become 5 locations across the state. I was always there, first to open, last to leave. I handled inventory, swept the floors, managed the taxes. There were no investors, no partners, just long nights and steady hands. Everything I earned went back into 2 things: the store and Lana. I packed her lunches every morning, wrote notes in her school books, paid for piano lessons, gymnastics, and every school trip that came with a price tag. When the time came for college, I cashed out the only savings account I had, smiled as she got on the plane, and cried in my car on the way home. She never knew I sold my wedding ring to help cover her tuition that first semester. There's something about being the person everyone depends on. You stop noticing how much of yourself gets used up in the process. I was proud, of course. Proud of the business. Proud of the home I made. But mostly proud of Lana. She had style, ambition, and presence. People noticed her when she walked into a room. I wanted her to have everything I never did. And maybe, in all those years of giving, I never stopped to ask if she still saw me as a mother, or just as a source. That question wouldn't get its answer until the day of her wedding. But even then, part of me still believed she would make room for me somewhere. If not in the front row, then at least at the back, where the forgotten are allowed to sit quietly and watch. Lana came to me in early spring, her voice shaking from excitement. She had just said yes to Mark, a man with a surname you read in the business section of the newspaper. His family was old money, East Coast lineage, the sort that played tennis on holidays and referred to summer as a verb. She looked radiant as she described the ring, her voice already laced with the vocabulary of his world, terms like signature cocktails, custom invitations, and European lace. I listened, smiling where appropriate, nodding when expected. Then she said quietly, as if the thought had just occurred to her, "The wedding is going to be, well, a little more than I expected." It didn't take long to see where the conversation was headed. Mark's parents had expectations, she explained. They were hosting the rehearsal dinner, of course, but the ceremony and reception needed to reflect a certain standard. Lana didn't say the word status, but it hung in the air between us like perfume, expensive, and meant to linger. So I asked her plainly what she needed. Her voice softened. She named a number that made my chest tighten, but I nodded, asking only how soon she needed it. She didn't hesitate to hug me tight and brief, then moved on to talking about venues. It was always like that with Lana. Gratitude came quickly, but never stayed long. Over the next several months, the expenses multiplied. The venue was a restored estate just outside of town, with stables turned into guest suites and a lake glittering behind the ceremony lawn. There were dress fittings, tasting menus, monogrammed linens, and a floral designer who flew in from Los Angeles twice. Each time a vendor needed a deposit, I was the one who paid it. Quietly, anonymously. Lana didn't want Mark's family to know she had help. "They already think I'm just some girl from Oregon," she said one night, her voice brittle. "They'd never understand our situation. Our situation. As if love, sacrifice, and scraping by had been a kind of failure." I told her not to worry, that I was happy to help. She smiled with relief, then returned to scrolling through centerpiece arrangements on her phone. I kept every receipt, though not for reimbursement. That was never the plan. I just needed to keep track, not for her, but for me. So that in the quiet of night, when doubt crept in, I could look at the numbers and remind myself that I had done what mothers do. I had supported, provided, and made her dreams possible. What I never realized was that, in making room for her dreams, I had slowly erased myself from the picture. The sun was just beginning to set behind the estate as I arrived, casting long shadows across the lawn. Rows of white chairs faced a floral archway, and servers in starched uniforms weaved through the guests carrying trays of champagne. I had dressed carefully, choosing a soft blue dress that had once been my Sunday best. I wore the pearl earrings Thomas gave me for our 10th anniversary. They were old, but polished, just like me. I walked slowly, absorbing it all, the music, the scent of roses in the air, the quiet murmurs of an audience waiting for something beautiful. I wasn't looking for attention. I didn't expect a fuss. I only wanted to take my seat, offer the small gift I had brought for Lana and Mark, and watch the child I had raised begin her new life. But I didn't even make it to the first row. Lana saw me before I saw her. She was radiant in her gown, surrounded by bridesmaids adjusting her veil, but when her eyes met mine, her face froze. She stepped forward quickly, her heels silent on the grass, and took me by the elbow as if guiding me to a quieter corner. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't smile. She just looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, you weren't invited. Go away." It didn't feel like a slap. It felt colder than that, like standing outside a window and realizing the lights inside are not meant for you. For a moment, I thought she must be joking, that this was some misunderstanding, some mistake in the seating chart or guest list. But then, she glanced over her shoulder, toward where Mark's parents stood talking to the event planner, and I understood. She was ashamed of me, ashamed of my past, my work, my hands that still bore calluses from unpacking boxes in the shop, ashamed of the woman who had built her future one brick at a time. I held her gaze. I didn't cry, I didn't plead. I didn't ask for an explanation. Instead, I nodded once, turned on my heel, and walked back the way I had come. My footsteps felt heavier now, as if the grass itself resisted each step. No one stopped me. No one called out. The music resumed, a gentle melody floating behind me as the ceremony prepared to begin, without me. In my car, I sat with my hands on the wheel, watching couples file into the venue in my rearview mirror. My heart beat slowly, each thump echoing in the hollow space her words had left behind. I didn't know what would happen next, only that something inside me had changed, something permanent, something that would not be silenced again. The engine idled softly as I sat in the driver's seat, hands still resting on the wheel, though I hadn't shifted out of park. The air was thick and still. My eyes lingered on the soft glow of the estate behind me. Laughter rose faintly from the guests now fully gathered, the ceremony just minutes away. I reached into my purse for my phone, more from habit than intention, and tapped it awake. A notification blinked at the top of the screen, final venue payment. Due by 3 p.m. It was 2:42. For weeks I had arranged the schedule in silence, making sure everything would be settled and seamless by the day. She said, "I do." The venue had split the total into 3 payments. 2 had already cleared from my account, pulled discreetly through transfers and cashier's checks. The last and largest was set to go through automatically. Lana hadn't asked how I managed it, and I hadn't volunteered the details. That had always been our rhythm. Her needing, me providing, both of us pretending it was nothing. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering above the confirmation button. My pulse echoed in my ears, not rushed, but heavy, deliberate. It wasn't anger I felt, not yet. It was something quieter, deeper, a sense of clarity that washed through me with surprising calm. She had told me to go away, not in anger, not in grief, but in a tone that made it clear I was not part of the picture she wanted the world to see. I had given everything to that picture, money, time, silence, and still I was a blemish in her eyes. So I opened the banking app. The button glowed red, "Cancel scheduled payment." I tapped it once. A confirmation box appeared. I didn't hesitate. I pressed again. Done. The screen refreshed. The transfer was gone. I stared at the balance for a moment, calculating the cost of all the choices I'd made. Then I powered off the phone and placed it gently back into my bag. The sun had dropped lower, casting golden light across the gravel drive. I could hear the music swell faintly again, the start of the procession, maybe. I didn't turn around. I started the car, shifted into gear, and pulled away slowly without glancing back. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about revenge or consequences. I wasn't imagining what would happen when the staff realized payment hadn't arrived, when the florist stopped arranging centerpieces, when the venue manager approached Mark's family with questions and balance sheets. I wasn't thinking about any of that. I was thinking about how it felt to make a decision that was mine alone. For the first time in years, I had chosen something that wasn't about protecting her or preserving her image. I had chosen myself. And as I drove away, the road ahead looked different, not wider, not easier, but open. Later that evening, after I had returned home and made myself a cup of tea I barely tasted, the calls began. At first, they came in slow trickles, Lana's name flashing on the screen, then Mark's, then a number I didn't recognize but assumed belonged to someone managing the event. I didn't answer any of them. I sat in my chair by the window, the one where I used to rock Lana to sleep when she had nightmares, and let the phone ring until it stopped. By morning, I had 22 missed calls and 7 voicemails. I listened to none of them. But I heard the story eventually. People talk, especially when something goes so spectacularly wrong in public. The venue staff began to whisper when the final check didn't come through. The caterer, having been stiffed on the final balance, halted dinner service before the first course. Waiters quietly disappeared from the floor. Plates were cleared before being filled. The string quartet, paid only for the first half of the evening, packed up at 7 and left mid-song. Guests were confused, then restless. Some thought it was part of the program, a surprise or clever twist. Others sensed something was off. When the wedding planner finally stepped away from the floral arch to speak to Mark's father about the missing funds, the illusion began to unravel. Mark's mother, polished and composed, apparently pulled Lana aside and asked why the contract hadn't been honored. Lana tried to explain, but the timeline collapsed under the weight of too many secrets. Eventually, the truth surfaced. There had been no shared wedding account. There was no trust fund covering the expenses. Every bill, every detail, every extravagance had been quietly handled by the woman who wasn't even invited to sit among the guests. Me. The whispers turned sharp. The celebration shrank into silence. The marriage, I would later learn, ended before it ever began. Mark left the estate that night, his family with him. Lana remained behind, surrounded by melting centerpieces and untouched platters. Her perfect night undone by the very foundation she had chosen to ignore. I didn't gloat. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was the slow settling of truth. She had built her fantasy on the back of someone she believed would never step out of line, never say no, never stop giving. And when I did, everything she had tried to hide crumbled in full view of the people she was so desperate to impress. For the first time, her deception was no longer my burden to carry. It had fallen, publicly and undeniably, into her own hands. It was 3 days later when she finally came to my door. I heard her before I saw her, the fast, hard knock, the shuffle of hurried steps on the porch. When I opened it, Lana stood there, still wearing traces of the wedding that never was. Her makeup had been wiped away, but a few smudges lingered like ghosts of the day. Her dress was gone, replaced by a simple blouse and slacks, but she looked smaller somehow, like someone had turned down the light inside her. "You ruined everything," she said before I could speak. Her voice cracked, the words sharp and brittle, like something that had already shattered. "You humiliated me. Do you even understand what you've done?" I didn't respond right away. I stepped aside and let her in. She paced the living room like a trapped bird, hands gesturing wildly, words spilling out in angry bursts. She blamed me for the collapse, for the guests leaving early, for Mark walking away without a word. She accused me of betrayal, of spite, of jealousy. I let her talk. I let her burn it all down right there in my living room because I had nothing left to protect, not her illusions, not the image she had crafted, not the role I had played for so long. When she finally stopped, breathless and trembling, I looked at her with the same eyes that had once watched over her crib at night, searching for signs of fever or fear. "I didn't ruin anything," I said quietly. "You did that the moment you decided I wasn't good enough to be seen beside you." She scoffed, turned her face away, but the silence that followed made room for more than anger. It made space for truth. "You asked for my help," I continued, "and I gave it. Every step of the way, I gave you my savings, my time, my silence. But you didn't just take what I offered. You took me for granted. You made me invisible. You used me to build something that you never intended to let me be part of." Her eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. She looked at me then, truly looked, and for the first time in years I wasn't sure she saw her mother standing there. I think she saw a woman she didn't recognize. A woman with limits. A woman who had said no. "I'm not angry," I told her. "Not anymore. I'm tired. Tired of being treated like something you have to explain away. I raised you with everything I had, and now I'm done apologizing for that." She didn't reply. She turned slowly, walked back to the door and paused with her hand on the knob. I waited, but she said nothing more. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence she left behind was vast, but it did not feel empty. It felt clean. The first time I saw Olivia after the wedding, she ran into my arms like nothing had changed. Her small frame collided with mine as she squealed, her little hands clutching my waist, her face buried in my stomach. She didn't ask why I hadn't been there or where the flowers and music had gone. She only told me she had drawn me a picture of our bookstore, the one she always said smelled like old paper and hugs. We sat on the floor of my living room with markers and construction paper spread between us. She chattered about her new dress and how the cake had fallen over before they even got to cut it. Her words tumbled freely, as children's words do, innocent and without agenda. I smiled, nodding as she talked, but part of me listened for something else, some echo of what Lana might have told her, some sign that she had been coached to see me differently. But there was nothing. Only love, uncomplicated and warm. Watching Olivia made something shift inside me. She was so young, untouched by the mess her mother had made, and yet already living inside the shadow of that same shame. One day, I thought, Lana might start to mold her the way she tried to mold herself, pressing down the softness, sanding off the edges, hiding where they came from, and I couldn't stop all of that. But I could do one thing. I could leave Olivia something that would last longer than disappointment. That night, I sat at my desk with the lamp casting a small, steady pool of light across a stack of folders. I pulled out every invoice, every receipt from the wedding, and calculated the total. It was more than I had let myself admit. Then I logged into my bank account and opened a new file on my computer. Olivia Educational Trust. I filled out the forms slowly, carefully, naming her as the sole beneficiary. I added a note in the section where they asked about purpose. I wrote, "For her books, her dreams, and the future her mother forgot to make room for." When I clicked submit, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt settled. Olivia would grow up someday. She would ask questions. She would put together her own story from the pieces we had left behind. When that time came, I wanted her to have something that told her she was always seen, always valued, that even when others chose pride, I had chosen her. And more than anything, I wanted her to know I hadn't left because I stopped loving. I had stepped back because I finally learned how to love without losing myself. The following week, I met with my attorney, a man named Harold, who had been doing my books since I opened the second store. He wore the same brown cardigan he always did, and his office still smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. He greeted me with quiet familiarity and a respectful nod, no questions asked. I slid the folder across the desk, the one with Olivia's name written carefully at the top in my handwriting. "I want to move the remainder into a trust," I said, keeping my voice even. "For Olivia, college, travel, whatever she dreams of. And I want it to be protected. No one else touches it." Harold opened the folder and began flipping through the pages, nodding as he read. He didn't ask why. He didn't mention the wedding or Lana or anything he might have heard through town whispers. That was one of the things I'd always appreciated about him. He worked in facts, not feelings. "It's more than enough for 4 years of school," he murmured, scanning the numbers. "Even with inflation. With growth, this could change her future." "That's the idea," I said, folding my hands in my lap. It took an hour to sign everything, to put the legal pieces in place that would ensure Olivia's trust could never be redirected, revoked, or quietly siphoned away. I initialed each page, steady and calm, as if I'd been preparing for this moment for years without realizing it. When it was done, Harold leaned back and looked at me with an expression I hadn't expected. It wasn't pity or even admiration. It was something quieter, a kind of acknowledgement. "Do you want her to know right away?" he asked. I thought about that. I thought about Olivia at 8 years old, building castles out of library books, and about the day she would one day stand at a crossroads with dreams in her hands and no idea how they'd be paid for. I wanted that moment to be one of freedom, not fear. "No," I said after a pause. "Not yet. Let her live without strings for a while, but someday, when she needs it, when she's ready, I want it waiting for her. I want her to know that someone believed in her before she even knew how to ask." I left Harold's office and stepped into the sharp chill of the afternoon. The air smelled like pine and wet sidewalks, the city still humming behind me. And for the first time in a long while, I felt lighter. I hadn't done it out of anger or guilt. I had done it because some part of me still believed that love didn't have to be loud to be real. It could be quiet. It could be paperwork and signatures and unspoken hope. It could be something that endures long after everything else fades. The house in Portland had grown too quiet. After Olivia's visits ended and the paperwork was filed, the rooms began to echo in ways I hadn't noticed before. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet more persistent. I would pass Lana's old bedroom and glance in without meaning to, the bed still neatly made, the desk untouched for years. Nothing in that room belonged to the woman she had become. So I began packing. Slowly at first. A drawer here, a shelf there. The books went into boxes first, labeled by author and genre out of old habit. The kitchen took longer, filled with pieces of my history, mugs chipped at the rim, a wooden spoon that had stirred decades of soup. I sorted items into 3 piles: keep, donate, release. The last pile grew faster than I expected. Neighbors stopped by when they saw the boxes on the porch. Some asked if I was downsizing, others if something had happened. I gave them all the same answer: "It's just time." Most nodded with a kind smile, but a few looked at me as if I had announced a divorce. Maybe, in a way, I had. A quiet separation from the life I had spent too long carrying alone. The attic held the last of it. Photographs in shoeboxes, letters tied with twine, Lana's old school trophies and drawings. I kept a few, the ones where she had drawn the 2 of us holding hands, where the sun had a face and the grass was always green. I placed those in a small envelope marked Olivia and tucked them into my purse. The rest I sorted carefully, pausing sometimes to run my fingers over old paper, to let memory pass through me like a draft from a window not quite shut. By the time the house was empty, it didn't feel like mine anymore. The walls were bare, the echoes deeper. I stood in the center of the living room, a single suitcase by the door, and took one last look. There were no tears, no dramatic parting, just a slow, deep breath and a sense of something finishing. I handed the keys to the realtor with a smile and walked out into the morning light. My car was packed, my destination quiet and waiting. I didn't look back. I had spent too much of my life looking over my shoulder, hoping for someone to catch up, to see me. Now, I was ready to see what waited ahead, beyond the weight of obligation, beyond the silence of rooms that no longer needed me. It was time for a new beginning, one shaped by my own choosing. The town was smaller than I remembered from the brochure, nestled along the rocky coast like something carefully placed and left untouched. The streets curved gently along the shoreline, lined with clapboard houses painted in soft grays and seafoam blues. Wind chimes whispered from porches, and the scent of salt hung in the air, clean and bracing. I found a cottage on the edge of town, not far from the harbor. It had wide windows and faded shutters, a sunroom that looked out over the water, and a garden overtaken by wildflowers. The realtor called it charming, though the porch needed paint and the roof a few shingles. I called it enough. My first night there, I left the windows open. The sound of waves lulled me to sleep in a way I hadn't felt in years, as if something deep inside me had finally been allowed to let go. I didn't unpack everything. I only opened what I needed: a few clothes, my books, a kettle for morning tea. The rest could wait. The neighbors were kind but not intrusive. They waved from their yards and brought fresh bread, not questions. I introduced myself simply. Eleanor, I used to run a bookstore. That seemed to satisfy them. No one asked what I had left behind, and I didn't volunteer. I began walking every morning, just after sunrise, down the narrow path that followed the cliffs. I wore the same jacket each day, pockets filled with shells Olivia would have loved. Sometimes I would sit on a bench overlooking the bay, the gulls crying overhead, and feel something close to peace rise in my chest. It wasn't happiness exactly, not yet, but it was the absence of ache. And that, in its own quiet way, felt like a beginning. I found myself breathing deeper, sleeping longer, speaking less. Not from sadness, but from contentment. There was no one here who needed anything from me. No one waiting for me to fix their life or pay their way or pretend not to notice the cost of being forgotten. Here, I could be a woman with no history, only a present. A woman with time to sit by the sea and let the salt air work its way through her hair and into her skin until she no longer smelled of bookstores or city sidewalks or regret. It wasn't a dramatic reinvention. I didn't dye my hair or take up painting or write a memoir. I simply lived, quietly, fully, and without apology. And for the first time in a long time, I belonged only to myself. It started with a flyer pinned to the corkboard inside the tiny post office. Seaside Book Club, Thursdays at 6 p.m., Public Library Reading Room. All welcome. The words were handwritten in neat script with a small drawing of a seagull in the corner. I stood reading it for a moment, then took down the tab with the contact number. The library was a small brick building with sun-faded windows and wooden floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. The reading room held 6 mismatched chairs, a coffee pot that burbled constantly, and a cat named Isabel who belonged to no one and everyone at once. The first meeting I attended, no one asked where I had come from. They only asked what I liked to read. I told them about my favorite authors, the books that had kept me company through grief and long winters. I spoke softly, not out of shyness, but from the deep pleasure of being listened to without interruption or expectation. The others shared too, a retired fisherman who loved spy novels, a widowed teacher with a passion for biographies, a young barista who had just discovered poetry. We disagreed often, but kindly, and laughter came easily. By the third meeting, I had brought a copy of a novel I used to recommend in my store. I passed it around the circle, watching their fingers trace the worn cover, their eyes lighting up at the description. We read it over the next 2 weeks, and during the discussion, I found myself leading, not deliberately, but naturally. I had done this before, after all, for most of my life, and in this quiet room by the sea, among strangers who were slowly becoming more than that, it felt like coming home to a part of myself I had almost forgotten. When the librarian asked if I'd consider hosting a monthly discussion group, I said yes, without hesitation. Not because I missed the business or the old routine, but because I had missed the sharing, the way books could open people, could make room for voices that might otherwise stay quiet. So I stood one Thursday evening, tea in hand, and read aloud the first chapter of a story about a woman finding her place in the world after being cast aside. No one flinched. No one shifted uncomfortably. They just listened. And as I read, I felt something settle into place, not like a door closing, but like one finally opening. There, in that circle of soft voices and worn pages, I began to stitch together a life not built around someone else's needs, but centered gently around my own. Not lonely, not loud, just real. And in that quiet, I started to hear myself again. There were things I never said to Lana, things I rehearsed in the quiet of my kitchen, over the rim of a teacup, or in the space between waking and sleep. Sometimes the words came sharp, other times soft, But they always ended the same way, unspoken, unfinished. So I began writing them down. The first letter started with no greeting, just a sentence that had lived inside me for years. I don't know when you stopped seeing me as a person. From there, the rest flowed. Memories, moments, confessions I had tucked away to keep the peace. I wrote slowly, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I didn't blame, I didn't defend, I simply told the truth. In one letter, I told her how it felt to watch her walk across the graduation stage, knowing my bank account was empty and my hands were raw from the extra shifts I had picked up to cover the final tuition bill. In another, I described the joy of holding Olivia for the first time and the ache that followed when I realized I might never be allowed to be more than an occasional figure in her life. I didn't write to change her. I had let go of that hope. I wrote because my heart needed room, and words gave shape to the silence that had been sitting on my chest for far too long. Some letters were only a page, others spanned several, written in the hush of early morning, before the world stirred. I kept them in a drawer in my bedroom, tied with a simple blue ribbon. I didn't seal them. They weren't meant to be sent. They were meant to live quietly, just like the feelings they carried. Not erased, not forgotten, but released from the burden of pretending they didn't exist. Sometimes I imagined what would happen if she ever found them. Would she be angry? Would she understand? I didn't dwell on it. These letters were not for her reckoning. They were for my healing. There is a certain freedom in writing to someone who will never read your words. It strips away performance. It asks only for honesty. And with every sentence, I felt more of myself return, less filtered, less fearful, more whole. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know if Lana and I would speak again or if the silence between us would stretch on until it became the shape of our relationship. But I knew that whatever path lay ahead, I had said what I needed to say, even if it was only to the paper, even if the only person who ever read the truth was me. It was a gray morning when I first noticed the little shop with the peeling awning and the dusty windows. It sat quietly on the corner of Main Street, nestled between a cafe and a hardware store, with a crooked for sale sign in the window. Most people walked past without a second glance. But I stopped. Inside, the shelves were bare and the walls faded, but the bones were there. The wooden floor creaked with familiarity. The front counter, though chipped and uneven, reminded me of the one I had sanded and painted myself all those years ago in Portland. I could almost see the ghost of my younger self behind it, arranging paperbacks and smiling at regulars. I asked the realtor for a tour, not expecting much, but the moment I stepped through the door, something stirred. It wasn't nostalgia exactly. It was recognition. A quiet understanding that this place could be mine, not as a business built for someone else's future, but as a home for the parts of me that still wanted to give, to connect, to share. The paperwork was simple, the renovations less so. I painted the walls myself, replaced the light fixtures, and filled the space with books from local authors, forgotten favorites, and handwritten notes tucked inside the covers. People came slowly at first, curious more than anything, but soon they stayed. They lingered. They told their friends. And one afternoon, under a soft drizzle that misted the sidewalks and fogged the glass, the new sign arrived. Simple black letters on a white wooden plank. Vance and Company. I ran my fingers over the name as it was mounted above the door. My name, no longer hidden behind someone else's ambition. I opened the shop the next morning with a pot of coffee and a table of staff picks. A little girl wandered in with her mother, her eyes wide at the shelves. I showed her the picture books, and when she asked if she could read one on the window seat, I nodded and offered her a blanket. People ask sometimes if I miss the city, or if I think I'll reopen another big store. I smile and say no, this is enough. This little corner by the sea, filled with stories and light, is all I need. Every now and then, I catch my reflection in the window as I lock up for the evening. The woman staring back at me isn't just a mother or a business owner. She isn't someone's provider or someone's mistake. She is her own story now, written in steady lines and quiet strength. And this time, her name is right there on the sign.